Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. In September of 2018, the United Nations Human Rights Council established a mechanism to investigate reports of serious international crimes and violations of human rights committed since 2011 in Myanmar, including in the Kachin, Rakhine, and Shan states. Nicholas Koumjian is the head of the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. He joins us on the show tonight. Nicholas, good evening. Can you maybe begin by telling us a little bit more about the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar and kind of positioning, explaining where it sits within the international framework?
Thank you, Melissa. It'd be my pleasure to do so. So our mechanism was established by the UN's highest human rights body, the Human Rights Council. And this establishment was also welcomed by the General Assembly. We're paid, our budget is paid by the general UN funds. We were given this mandate, as you said, to collect evidence of the most serious international crimes committed in Myanmar since 2011. So it covers the entire territory of Myanmar. It covers only serious international crimes, which include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. And then in terms of the time period, it's from 2011, but it's ongoing until it's changed. If a crime happens today, or if it happens next month or next year, it could, if it's a serious international crime, it would fall within our mandate. And then it's important to understand the territorial aspect. The crimes have to occur on the territory of Myanmar to fall within our mandate. If refugees flee Myanmar and something happens to them outside of the borders, that's not within our mandate.
Right.
What we are not is a court. We're a body that's supposed to collect the evidence and then to prepare files that could facilitate criminal prosecutions in a national, regional, or international court. So we ourselves do not have the power to arrest anyone or to charge anyone, but we would work with different courts that could have jurisdiction, provided that they're willing and able to give a fair trial and respect all international rights about fair trial and not impose the death penalty. That's a United Nations principle. So specifically, the Human Rights Council has encouraged us to cooperate with the International Criminal Court investigation of the Rohingya situation, and also with the case before the International Court of Justice. This is very interesting. This is not a criminal case, but it's a case where the state of Gambia, acting on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Countries, has alleged that Myanmar has violated its obligations under the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide by failing to take reasonable measures to prevent and punish genocide. And we are assisting the parties by providing relevant evidence that we hope will allow the judges to make an informed decision in that very important case.
Nicholas, could you help us understand why this period was chosen when we take into consideration the fact that Myanmar had a long period under military rule, 50 years of fighting civil wars on many fronts, huge amounts of violation. And then we had this nominally democratic period, which is when this mechanism was established. And then we've now returned to a kind of military junta-run situation with some really obvious crimes being committed almost on a daily basis, right? So why just 2011? Why not that whole long history of violence committed by successive military regimes?
Well, thank you. I'd be speculating a bit because I was not part of that decision. But I think part of it is even going back to 2011, collecting evidence for what now is a 10-year time period is massive undertaking. Of course, the longer you go back, the more likely the perpetrators are also no longer alive and not prosecutable. I think 2011, I'm again speculating a bit, was chosen because in that year, the Tatmadaw began an offensive in the north and some areas that had previously been under a ceasefire. And there was conflict with some ethnic armed groups in the north of the country. And then in 2012, the very next year, there was violence in Rakhine State. And again, even at that time, a Rohingya exodus from Rakhine State in 2012. So I think the Human Rights Council recognized that what happened in 2017, I think they were largely reacting to the Rohingya crisis of 2017, but that it was very important to recognize that this wasn't a one-off. This wasn't something new. This wasn't something necessarily spontaneous with no precedence. Rather, it was consistent with the suffering that civilians have undergone in Myanmar in different parts of the country, different ethnic groups, in similar fashion because of similar strategies used throughout the country. And I think the Human Rights Council recognized it was important to capture the fact that the 2017 violence was not unique. So they expanded it up to 2011.
Well, it sounds like a mammoth task. I mean, you're trying to collect data, again, evidence from, as you said, the past decade or so. But I'm wondering, how do you, keep the truth of what happened from completely disappearing or, from being lost? What is that like? I'm trying to understand the challenges of collecting evidence on this scale. What is it that you look for particularly?
Oh, you're right. It is a massive undertaking, and we certainly understand it's going to be impossible to capture everything and every crime that happened. There are tens of thousands of potential crimes and even more victims of crimes. But we think it's critical to preserve the evidence now. Even if there isn't a court proceeding imminent, it's important to preserve the evidence because memories fade, documents get destroyed, witnesses pass away, crime scenes are disturbed, the wounds heal, the bodies decompose. So it's very important to try to preserve the evidence now. And I have some experience with that, having come previous to the current position that I'm in with dealing with Myanmar. I was the international co-prosecutor at the Khmer Rouge Tribunal in Cambodia. And those proceedings really got off the ground in 2007, but they were covering crimes almost 30 years earlier, crimes between 1975 and 1979. But one of the things, we were very fortunate that there had been an effort, particularly by a civil organization, DC CAM, in the 90s, to collect evidence, to collect testimonies, to speak to people about what they remembered, what experiences they had during the Khmer Rouge regime, even to go to crime scenes and look at locations of mass graves. So that and to collect documents that were still in existence from the Khmer Rouge time period. All of that was very critical evidence in the trials we had between 2017 and 2017, 18. We used that evidence. It was very useful to us. So I think people have recognized that those who are the victims of crimes have a very long memory about what happened to them, and their desire for justice really exists throughout their lives. It doesn't end. It's important to preserve the evidence now so it's not lost forever.
Nicholas, isn't it also true, though, that even something as undeniable as the Khmer Rouge genocide or the Cambodian genocide is contested? And there are people who will say that the museum in Tuol Sleng is part of the Vietnamese plot, and so on and so forth, right? And that it's given the sanction of the state because those in the current state have an interest in preserving that particular perspective on what happened in the 70s. I mean, is in your work also kind of caught up in this contestation about the past?
Absolutely. The past, history isn't static. People try to move it, people try to manipulate it. But the truth, of course, the truth is there is only one truth. And it's horribly offensive to those who had family that they lost in Tuol Sleng, the prison you're talking about. 12,000 individuals were killed by the regime in that prison, most of them tortured, badly, horribly tortured before they were killed. So when people come up and give conspiracy theories that somehow this wasn't really a true history of what happened, that this didn't really occur, this is terribly offensive. So it's very important to victims to establish the truth, to preserve that evidence while it now exists. And the evidence about Tuol Sleng is overwhelming, including the confessions of the head of that about the fact that everyone who went in there was destined to be killed, and he followed orders to torture to obtain confessions from them. We think that's why it's absolutely critical. Another thing I found living in Phnom Penh and working on those cases, it's especially important for young people, because young people often don't have trust in authorities. And many of them simply didn't believe even the stories of their own parents. I had many instances where people would say, yes, my daughter, I told her about that we didn't have enough to eat. We were starving. They said, well, why didn't you pick fruit? Well, because if you picked fruit, you could be killed. People were killed for picking up a piece of fruit off the ground that had fallen to the ground. But it's very hard for young people to understand that unless this truth is really preserved and professionally collected and the evidence objectively analyzed.
Well, we talked about the challenges a little bit earlier about going back in time and collecting the evidence, as you say, needing to preserve that. But has it become easier because of the, because everyone has a smartphone, has a camera in their pocket, is able to document history? Has collecting evidence become easier in the age of technology?
Collecting it has definitely become easier. And this is really something, the first time I've experienced it, because I worked on conflicts from the Yugoslavia in the 90s and Sierra Leone in the 90s, Khmer Rouge in the 70s, and Darfur even in the first decade of this century. But in none of those conflicts do we have the phenomena that we have here, where as crimes are happening, people are taking out a cell phone and they're recording a village being burned. They're recording a demonstration where police shoot at individuals, or they're in an apartment and they're recording police beating medical workers who were there at a protest to help those who were injured at protests. But that said, while it means more evidence, for those of us collecting it and analyzing it, it's a whole lot more work. It's a huge challenge. Since the coup happened in Myanmar in February, we put out a call asking for those who had evidence of illegal orders to share the evidence with us. And partly in response to that and other information media reports about our activities, we received over 200,000 communications. And most of those did have attachments with photographs or videos. So we have 1.5 million evidence items over that we have collected. It's really a challenge to organize that systematically. Just going through those and removing duplicates and understanding which are originals, which are copies. This is a huge challenge, but this is something that we're using the most modern technology to deal with that. But absolutely, it creates both opportunities and challenges to us, all this new technology.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but we'll come back and continue this conversation with Nicholas Koumjian in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned, we'll be right back. Thanks so much for staying with Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Let's continue our conversation with Nicholas Koumjian, head of the UN Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. Nicholas, you mentioned the Myanmar mechanism had collected over 200,000 communications, 1.5 million items of evidence, and you're in the process of analyzing that, and that presents a huge challenge for the team. But what is the evidence being analyzed and preserved for? You mentioned that the office does not prosecute, that it serves as a repository for potential evidence. Can you walk us through what would happen next? I'm just wondering, from someone watching the outside, what is that system like for prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity?
Right, well, thank you so much. Well, we're really the third mechanism that has been established by the United Nations. And this is something fairly new. There's a mechanism for Syria and another mechanism based in Iraq that looks only at the crimes of ISIS. And our predecessors preceded us by a couple years. And each of us are not a courts, but collecting evidence to aid national or international courts who are able and willing to prosecute these cases, respecting all international fair trial rights. So, of course, we would hope that someday the evidence that we collect, the ideal would be that it's used in Myanmar. If you have authorities that are really interested in holding to account those responsible for serious crimes and giving them fair trials, that would be the ideal, that someday it could be used in Myanmar. In the meantime, we do have these two international proceedings ongoing at the International Criminal Court and also at the International Court of Justice. And we're cooperating with those proceedings, sharing evidence with them. There also is another case going. This is an example of national proceedings outside of Myanmar. This is an exercise of universal jurisdiction. Normally and most traditionally in national laws of each country gave that country jurisdiction to try crimes that occurred on their own territory. But sometimes, especially in more recent times, the elements for jurisdiction have been expanded. So they allow a court to exercise jurisdiction over crimes that may have happened outside their territory if the perpetrator was their national, or perhaps if the victim was their national, their citizen. Other times, other courts say, well, if the perpetrator lives in our country, then we can prosecute the case if he's moved here. Others say, well, even if he just sets foot on our territory, that gives us jurisdiction to arrest and hold this person to account. And then there's, in a few cases, there's real universal jurisdiction. And one country that has that is Argentina, that allows the courts of Argentina to investigate genocide and crimes against humanity that occurred anywhere in the world. Because there's a recognition that these are crimes of such seriousness that they do offend the rights of everyone in the world when crimes against humanity or genocide occur. And in fact, a group did take a case to the courts in Argentina and made a complaint asking the courts in Argentina to do a criminal investigation. The case was filed on behalf of 6 women who are now in Bangladesh, refugees from Rakhine State, 6 Rohingya women. Initially, the lower court decided it would not open the investigation because it felt that it was duplicative of what the International Criminal Court was doing. But just very recently, the appeals chamber in Argentina reversed that and ordered the lower court to open an investigation. So we will be in contact with the court. We actually have already written to the court and explained our mandate and that we would consider any request for evidence and we could share our evidence with them, provided, again, that it's fair proceedings. But I think it's very important for me to point out, especially to those, for the sake of those who may be interested in sharing evidence with us, we only share evidence when we have the consent of those that provided it to us. So, we would always seek the consent of those who provided the information. Can we share it, for example, with the International Criminal Court? Can we share it with the courts in Argentina? And we also would make our own independent determination. If we share this information, could it endanger anyone? And if we thought it would, we would not share the information. And finally, we reserve the right in a few cases not to share information if it would compromise our own efforts to verify, ongoing efforts to verify information, our own, you could say, investigative efforts to verify information.
Nicholas, does this or any of this have a deterrent effect on perpetrators, especially in ongoing conflict?
I hope so, and I believe so. I've heard of, when I worked at the Yugoslav tribunal also, and I heard of a intercept where the soldiers of the one group were heard saying, I got this order, but I told my commander, you do it, because I don't want to go to The Hague. I don't want to be indicted for these crimes. This is criminal. Does prosecuting murders in in Kuala Lumpur deter murder? Does prosecuting rape cases in Los Angeles deter rapes? I think we all believe it does. We all think that if we didn't prosecute anyone, if you said you could rape and murder and no one would ever arrest you or you'd never face any punishment, the number of people who commit murders and rapes would increase. So I do believe that it deters crimes. We've seen many times that people are very conscious of what we're doing in other international justice efforts. It's very possible we already have deterred some crimes because unfortunately, you can never prove what did not happen. It didn't happen because of us, because what was in the mind of the perpetrator was being afraid of possibly being prosecuted. But absolutely, I think it does deter crimes.
Just on that note, if I'm ask you for your observations and your experience, you've got 35 years of experience as a prosecutor, much of that working in the field of international criminal justice. I'm wondering, with looking at the work that you've done in Timor-Leste, in Bosnia, and Sierra Leone, and in Cambodia, as you mentioned a bit earlier, what are the similarities that you observed in the way history repeats itself, in the perpetrators of crimes against humanity and war crimes? How did these situations, which are a combination of many things, I'm sure, what kind of conducive environments allow for this? Maybe you can share a little bit about what you've observed so far.
Well, I've thought about that, and what I've always felt is that what we see so often is that these worst crimes happen, genocide or crimes against humanity, when bad leaders convince their own people, their own followers, that another group is somehow a threat to them, demonizing another group, that our culture, our religion, our nationality is at risk because of this other group. So they're our enemies and they have to be eliminated. And so this type of hate speech, sometimes it's much more subtle than what I just said. Other times it's even more open and blatant than what I just said. But all of those efforts, I think, are very, very serious. And this is what I think we see in common. This kind of appeals to conspiracy theories and a little bit of paranoia and just the demonizing another group, making another group seem less than human, and they're a threat to us. In order to protect your group, you have to attack these other people. So that's what I found in all these different conflicts. And then if I could also talk about the commonality of victims. I've talked to victims from Africa, Sierra Leone, Darfur, Bosnia, Cambodia, and Myanmar. What I find in common for most of them is most of them want to talk about what happened to them because they want the world to recognize this occurred. This really happened. This isn't in my imagination. This really happened. It makes some satisfaction to having that recognized, especially by some international court or international authorities. And second, they want those persons who are really responsible held to account, that they face some punishment for all the suffering that they inflicted on their families, their friends, on themselves. So I find this is quite universal in people all around the world of very diverse cultures, religions, nationalities.
Nicholas, it seems like the Syrians or the people in Iraq suffering under ISIS or had been victims in the past in Myanmar are kind of lucky. They have this mechanism working for them. How many more conflict situations, how many more communities are invisible? How many more mechanisms ought there be to deal fairly with the range of injustices that we see happening in our time?
Yes, that's very hard to say. Of course, there's financial limits to what the international community is willing to finance. These international justice efforts are not cheap. Mechanisms are much, much cheaper than courts. Our kinds of efforts are much cheaper than establishing a court. But also we don't have the benefit of ultimately holding people responsible. We still need to find a court someday to hear these cases. But absolutely, there are victims around the world and conflicts that some of us have never heard about. and they too want justice, and they're not getting it, and they hope for some kind of international recognition of what's happening to them.
Right. Well, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention and telling us a little bit more about the Myanmar mechanism. Appreciate your time tonight. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you. All the best.
That was our conversation with Nicholas Koumjian from the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, and that wraps up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night.